Meeta Anand, it's a real pleasure to have you here on the show, my friend.
Lurie, I can't even tell you. I woke up this morning, it was gray, it was cloudy, it was snowy, and I still jumped out of bed because I knew I got to speak with you today.
There's a love here, Meeta. There's a real love. And that even exists before I got my hands on your most recent report. This is a phenomenal report, and I thought it was something that we absolutely need to talk about on this show because we deal with the intersection of race, gender, culture, identity, politics, and the law. And this report from the Leadership Conference entitled Disaggregation Nation, a landscape review of state and race ethnicity data collection. I thought this is, if we'd have had something like this for the 2020 census, it probably would have made both of our lives a lot easier. For those who are not clear, can you talk to us about what is data disaggregation, and why does it matter so much when it comes to issues of racial justice, health justice, and other areas that many of us are really concerned about?
Sure, absolutely. So picture you go to an office, any office, like a doctor's office, or you're filling out your driver's license form, or you are filling out the census. But let's stick with, say, a doctor's office. Sometimes, and I don't know if this has ever happened to you, Lurie, like you can get there and your choices are white, black, and other.
Mm-hmm.
And, we know that in this wonderful, beautiful, multiracial democracy that we have, we are more than white, black, and other. There are different ethnicities, there are different races. You can have Asian, and then let's talk about Asian as a category. Asian encompasses both, say, India and China, which are very different peoples. Now, these people, we all know that race is a construct. We all know that. But at the same time, it's a construct that has embedded to have real life implications, right? I assume that's the point of this very show. So we're looking at this construct that now is a lived experience. And your lived experience can vary based on your race and ethnicity. So when you look at healthcare outcomes, and we can talk about COVID, right? There was the initial, here is how many people are getting it, and here's your likelihood of dying. And then you started delving down when you were able to get the data into more specific communities. And you could see, oh, these communities are not getting vaccinated, or these communities are more likely to be hospitalized. And then you can start doing targeted interventions. So this is why it starts getting really important. So when we say disaggregated, it's like, firstly, let's go beyond white, black, and other. But secondly, look, even in these broad categories, let's allow people to be able to self-describe and self-identify in a more meaningful way. So disaggregated basically means more granular.
More granular, getting to the what's underneath those very broad categories of black, of white, of other. Particularly, and I'm so glad you noted the fact that race is this purely made up construct. And I know it still boggles the mind of many people in this audience that North Africans, for example, might be classified as Caucasian. It boggles the mind that the way that race functions is so funky in so many ways that it's not a one-to-one parallel. So the way we describe and intersect with race here in this country, in America, is not at all necessarily the same way that people describe or identify racially in other countries. I remember studying race in Latin America, and there are some countries, Mita, that have 17, between up to 20 different labels and categories to describe different shades of brown. And so we're not even talking about, black, white, other in those spaces. We're talking about cafe au lait. We're talking about morena. We're talking about all of these other things that just are talking really to the variations of racial makeups. And we're all sort of, it feels like in many ways, Meeta, when it comes to issues of race, trying to figure out how to make sense out of a system that was inherently designed to not really make a whole lot of sense.
I think that's right. And this is, I think, the other key part of our report is part of a greater effort we have at the Leadership Conference in helping communities to understand the importance of data and engaging with it. Because if we do not ourselves engage with what are the categories that are being used, then it's being imposed upon us versus talking to people and being like, what is helpful to you? What is useful to you? How do you self-identify? How do you see yourself in this construct? Because otherwise, yes, we're left with ideas of yesteryear. So this report talks about state standards, like how are states looking at collecting the data? But this is in a general context of a federal collection standard that you just referenced by saying people from Middle East and North Africa get recoded as white per standards put in place by the federal government in 1997. Do you know how long ago 1997 is, Lurie?
A long time ago. Ask my
And
kids. It doesn't even exist in terms of real
right,
time.
right. And I don't know about you, but like I think for me and for a lot of people, how we conceive of race and intersectionality and how we all interact with each other and how it comes to play in our day-to-day lives, whether it's civic engagement, health, education, employment, how our views of this have evolved in that intervening time. So we need to have that engagement to ensure that people can see themselves in the form. Like, are we ever going to get it right? No, no, because you cannot have like 251 categories because that would start becoming meaningless. But you can start getting it to a point where you can make it meaningful and actionable.
Mm. You know, as you're talking, I'm reminded of some of the things we saw during the census, which is for a lot of people one of the greatest data gathering exercises that the nation engages in. Although I will remind people that the census, yes, it happens in every year ending in zero, but every single year, the Census Bureau and other data collecting services are doing the work of figuring out metrics, figuring out how many people are unemployed, how many people are still searching, how many people live where and where they're moving, what are their migratory patterns. This is a data collection is a hugely important thing. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of people from within the African American community who are vibrantly a part of this conversation. We don't have a lot of people from the Latino American community who are vibrantly a part of this conversation. So part of this discussion, Meeta, although it is altruistic, is also me trying to plant seeds because I want people to get involved in data collection. We can't have folks like Dr. Zalima Blair being one of the only ones who are looking at some of these statistical issues. And I remember during the census campaign when we were reaching out to Black men in particular, of all ethnicities, right? Reaching out to Black men in particular. And I had to come up with some examples for why Black men, who are one of the groups who rationally fears engagement with the census, how we could get them to engage. And I remember focusing on prostate cancer. If I'm the Center for Disease Control, Meeta, and I have money and resources that I want to invest in research on prostate cancer, how to minimize prostate cancer. And again, for those of you who are listening, you know that we focus a lot on prostate cancer on this show because one is something that contributed to my father's demise and has really impacted so many people. Our own Joe Madison currently battling prostate cancer. And I would tell these Black men, listen, if I'm the CDC and I've got $5 million to invest in research for prostate cancer, and your community is a community that has a lot of prostate cancer, but you're not filling out the census, you're not going to get this $5 million because I don't, for the purposes of data collection, I don't even see you as the CDC. Now, that was an example that had a lot of resonance, and people really, they were like, whoa, that it didn't even matter. Hadn't even made sense to them in that way before. So when we're talking about this state level of aggregating data and disaggregating data, what are some of the policy implications at the state level for how disaggregated data might better help the provision of services for people who obviously are pretty much in a lot of need?
Well, I think you got to one right there, right? CDC, you replicate that down at the state level. You know who else really cares about this type of data? Education departments. You need to know who is attending your schools, what services they might need. Like this is closely tied as well to language access. Also to be able to measure outcomes. And by this, I want to be clear, and I know you know this, right? Measuring outcomes not so that we are blaming the individuals for the outcomes that we see, but measuring the outcomes in a context of greater data and putting it together and being like, okay, kids in this school district are suffering, and this is the makeup of that. And are we seeing the effects of greater structural inequities playing themselves out? So you look at education, obviously voting plays out at both the federal and the state levels. And the amount of things that popped into my head as you just talked about your example, I was thinking about the recent redistricting case in Alabama, where the Supreme Court, believe it or not, was the one that was like, I don't know, you didn't do that right, and you are not properly reflecting Black communities. Well, you know what we do know, Lurie, is that Black communities are persistently undercounted year after year after year. And you know who's really missing in this? Black men. And you named one of the reasons, but there are many reasons. But can you imagine? This is with an undercount. They were saying, oh my God, you've gone too far. What if we had the real numbers? It would just be even more shocking. And to me, this is the other point of disaggregation. So let's go back to this. People from Middle East, North Africa get reclassified as white. That means that you're making it overall inaccurate. And if you were to sort of make it more clear as to who is in the more powered, more privileged part, and make the white part not have people who are not living a white experience, then the sharpness of the inequities would be brought into even greater relief.
Yeah, yeah. As you're saying that, there's this constant note of fear that many in our country have at this idea that by, 2040, if not sooner, America is going to now become a majority person of color nation. I don't like saying majority minority because does that really make sense? It's going to be the global majority is going to be more prevalent in this nation than are white Americans. And for some people that strikes a real note of fear. But I'm of the opinion, Meeta, that if we were properly classifying people, if we were properly counting people, if we were not reclassifying Middle Eastern or North Africans as European, I think they might already be at a point where we are no longer majority white nation. And so data manipulation drives policy in a lot of ways. We know that historically, when there's been a lot of fears about the browning of a nation, that not just this country, but all throughout Latin America, we have seen immigration restrictions on countries with melanated populations. You can't come here, but we'll take all the Europeans. We're going to proactively recruit Europeans to come into the nation so that we can artificially augment the numbers and maintain some sort of power just based on numbers alone. So the data matters.
And I think one way of putting it, Lurie, right, is like showing up in the data allows us to tell our stories, right? And if we are not showing up in the data, that means other people are coming in and telling the stories for us, right? And they are the ones that are manipulating it. So the manipulation allows people to tell a different story of what's happening in our society instead of just reflecting back the richness of who we are.
That's right. That's right. With this report in particular, was there anything that stuck out to you that was surprising? Anything that you all learned that you weren't necessarily prepared for or wasn't a part of your initial calculus as you went into it?
So we commissioned this because we were thinking, okay, there's some momentum here, and there's a federal context where this is happening. While the report was being written, more and more states were passing laws, or advocates were advocating for laws for increased data disaggregation. So it was a happy surprise because we thought it would paint a bleaker picture than it did. But instead, what we were able to see is a true momentum and groundswell of community groups engaging with communities, educating them about the importance of data and showing up in data. And so to me, it indicated that the moment is actually ripe for this work and to really start advocating for change here. And I believe as we advocate for change, that will allow us to do exactly what you were talking about, Lurie, which is have our communities understand that we need to be present in data collection so that, our histories are not being erased, our stories are not being erased, our experiences are not being erased, and policies can then take us into account.
I love that. And I'm not just going to say I love that because it's good. It is good, but I also love it because it's going to make my job a lot easier. Meeta, one of the challenges we had with the 2020 census, which we hopefully will not have in the same way in the 2030, is we at the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers College, we issued a Communities of Interest report that was looking at Black migratory patterns throughout the state of New York for the previous 2 census cycles. And one of the things we learned was that a lot of people were saying Black people have left the state. Black people have left the state of New York. York and we're struggling because not all the Black people have left the state, our research team was able to determine, okay, yes, we are seeing there is a massive outflow. However, it's not that people are necessarily leaving the state. They're relocating to other places within the state, largely because of housing options, education options. So while a lot of people were saying the Black population is ended in New York, where we're gone, we're lost, what we were able to find was that a lot of people were, for example, leaving Brooklyn and going to the Bronx, right, which was one of the most affordable locations. We were seeing that there were some differences with West African immigrants and their migratory patterns as opposed to those who were part of the Black American branch of the diaspora. The Afro-Caribbeans were very heavily still migrating within Brooklyn. And all of that matters because if I have services and resources, I can target, as you said, more hyper target and specify who I need to reach. I'm not just thinking about Black. I'm thinking about perhaps Black with language barriers. I'm thinking about perhaps Black with different sorts of family structures that might have some parts of the Pan-African tree, might have more multi-generational housing concerns, and we might have to address that differently. It allows us to be better at being servants to the people, and I'm glad to see that one of the pleasant surprises was that you were finding more and more states were calling for this. And I'm wondering, Meeta, if there is a way that we can sort of, are we seeing a movement beyond the state level? Are we seeing any of this demand for more disaggregation of data at the census level, for example? You've mentioned Middle Eastern and North African communities a number of times. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, and I don't think I am, there was a really vibrant demand and cry for having Middle Eastern, North African included as a category on the census that did not ultimately get adopted. Talk with us about how some of these efforts are showing up at the federal level.
Absolutely. So this will not come as a surprise to you, I don't think, but that it was looking very close to actually getting that category for the 2020 census. And then 2016 happened, and we all know what happened then. A lot of things came to a screeching halt. I will not, name the reason why. I think we all know why. So the federal standards, it's called Statistical Policy Directive 15. That's the last time I'll sound so boring. But the federal standards that govern it, they went out for revisions and comment. And one of the proposed revisions is the inclusion of a Middle Eastern North African category. And I think, one thing I neglected to say before is that category, if you can imagine, is also important for tracking things like hate crimes, where we have hate crime reporting data, where you can imagine if that keeps being reclassified in other categories, you're not really capturing any sort of anti-Arab discrimination that's going on as well. So anyway, the Office of Management and Budget, which, believe it or not, is the one that controls the standards, has announced that they will announce new standards by this summer, which, if it happens, that means our 2030 census, knock on wood, would have the Middle Eastern North African category. The other thing we're advocating for is a disaggregated data category. So particularly, it's most commonly seen as an issue, again, in Asian communities, so that people can further self-identify beyond Asian. We don't know whether any of these things will go through. We're just hopeful and excited that these revisions are potentially out there and that we'll see these new categories. And Lurie, you mentioned how data is not just the decennial census. So, there's the American Community Survey, which goes to a percentage of all Americans every year. And it asks a lot of questions. I got it once. I myself was shocked, and I do this work. But these questions are there for a reason, and it helps us understand who we are as a country, education levels, income levels, all of these things, like, how many bedrooms are in your house. This helps us make policy, right? Mm-hmm. And new race and ethnicity categories would go on the American Community Survey. So we would have that really granular data at a community level that becomes meaningful, so that you can do that hyper targeting that you were talking about.
Wow. And y'all, think about this in a practical sense. And I'm so glad you highlighted that, Meeta, because if you are, for example, a senior citizen and you have a wheelchair or you use a walker, you don't just need public transportation on your block. You need public transit. You need the type of bus that is going to be able to raise and lower to accommodate your aging body. If I am a policymaker and I don't know that there are people in your community with a significant number of wheelchairs and walkers, I'm just going to send you a whole bunch of regular buses and go with God. Good luck if you can get on if you can. And so having access to the data, it's not about trying to find you and trying to, figure out where you're at and what you're doing. It's not a manipulative negative thing. It really is so that we can ensure that communities have greater access to resources. Meeta, we're literally at the end of this segment, but I want to squeeze this last question in if I can. There are some folks who do believe that greater access to data is harmful, and that if we aren't just all listed as Black, then we're going to lessen our power. And you are a woman of Haitian American heritage and South Asian heritage. I mean, so you're seeing this from inside the room in some different ways. Are we losing power if we don't all just identify as Black? Like, what if some of us are Haitian? What if some of us are Jamaican? What if some of us are Trinidadian? Is there a loss of power by knowing how many of us come from different branches of the Pan-African diaspora?
Well, Lurie, I'm sure you won't be shocked that my answer is no. It actually leads to greater power, because when you disaggregate data, you know what you can do then? You can aggregate back up. And when you disaggregate and allow people to identify as how they feel they are, you're going to, my theory, my supposition, my hypothesis is that you're going to get more people actually filling out the forms, because they're going to say, this is speaking to me. They want me. They actually understand who I am. Oh, this is where I belong. Because can you imagine if you're looking at a form and you're like, well, I don't see myself here, and this looks really intrusive. Like, it's a totally rational decision to not fill out the form. But if you get people starting to see themselves in the form at that more granular level, we can always then aggregate back up, sum it back up, and get to that power number. So it's still about understanding how we exist in solidarity and community, but then allowing us to also recognize the differences that exist within that in order to be able to service and serve and resource all communities at the levels they deserve.
Meeta, I'm missing our tea times. We're going to have to connect off the air, because we have a lot of civic justice to get engaged in, my friend. And I have always appreciated having you as a partner in this work. But yeah, we're going to have to, it shouldn't be that we have a major report coming out, which is why we get a chance to reconnect. So be on the lookout for my email. We're going to connect again in real life. In the interim, however, how can people follow you and the work at the Leadership Conference? You guys are doing some amazing things out there. What's the best way for folks to connect with the work that's happening in that space?
Yeah, so I would just go to our website, which is civilrights.org, has that for our website, and you can find our data equity page, and there's a sign up to be part of our data disaggregation network, and all of our social handles are civilrights.org. So at civilrights.org, easy to find us, and always happy to hear from anyone.